They say the Sahara is beautiful, endless waves of gold under a burning sky, a place so vast and quiet it humbles you. But that day, as I loaded the last of my equipment into the back of my four-wheel drive pickup, it felt just like another job. The sun was still rising over the eastern horizon, spilling amber light across the hard-packed sand behind the telecom base station. I'd done dozens of tower inspections like this one. Routine. Predictable. In and out in 2 days. I was Zach Khalid, 42, field technician for a satellite and wireless infrastructure firm contracted to maintain remote towers across North Africa. We served military installations, oil operations, and nomadic communities alike. Some of the towers were so deep in the desert that we used camels or drones just to get the parts to them. But not this one. This was Station B-17, supposedly less than 100 kilometers southwest of the base. A long stretch, but manageable. The satellite image showed a straight route. No rugged terrain. No surprises. Or so I thought. I did my usual checks, spare tires too, fully inflated. Jerry cans of diesel 3, filled to the top. Water 8 liters in total. Food: dried fruits, nuts, dates, some military-style rations. Satellite phone, first aid kit, flashlight, tarp, hand tools, multimeter, and the beacon, a GPS unit with a built-in distress signal. The vehicle was a sturdy Toyota Hilux, modified for off-road work. Sand tires. Reinforced suspension. Steel bumpers. I slammed the tailgate shut and gave it a thump with my palm, then looked over at the mechanic standing nearby. Hakeem, the base engineer, was squinting at the rising sun, sweat already forming under his ball cap. "Make sure to check your tires before the dunes," he said, nodding toward the west. "Pressure changes fast once the heat kicks in." "I know," I said, forcing a smile. "It's just a day and a half. I'll be back before Friday prayer." He didn't look convinced. "Storms have been weird lately. You sure you don't want a guide?" I shook my head. "Too remote. I've got the beacon if anything goes wrong." Those words, I'd regret them later. But that morning, I believed them. I climbed into the driver's seat, buckled in, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, smooth and responsive. I set the GPS unit to track my movement and pressed start log. The map blinked, then drew a thin blue line toward my destination. I had offline maps, too. I was prepared. Or so I thought. The drive began easily. The road west out of the base was paved for the first 20 kilometers. A luxury in these parts. Beyond that, it turned to packed sand and gravel. The Hilux handled it without complaint. I sipped water slowly, watching the heat shimmer begin to rise off the landscape around mid-morning. Radio chatter was silent except for the occasional automated system check. It felt like freedom in the beginning. Just me, the desert, and the open road. After an hour, the landscape began to shift. Small dunes appeared like sleeping giants, their curves shaped by years of whispering wind. Occasionally, I'd spot an acacia tree or a cluster of dry shrubs, their roots somehow still clinging to life. Once, I saw a few birds circling high above, maybe scouting for rodents or snakes. but there were no signs of humans. No tire tracks, no litter, nothing. Just that eerie, timeless quiet the Sahara is known for. I stopped for a quick check near midday. Ate a few dates, stretched my legs, and checked the tire pressure. All good. I rechecked the GPS. Still tracking. Station B17 lay ahead, another 40 kilometers. I figured I'd arrive by late afternoon, inspect the tower, and camp out beside it overnight like I'd done dozens of times before. But then the wind shifted. It started as a whisper, just a soft, rising hum. I noticed sand lifting in tiny spirals on the edges of the horizon. Nothing to panic about yet. But within 10 minutes, the sky was starting to blur. The sun's brightness dimmed. Dust was filling the air. A sandstorm. I didn't wait. I turned the hillocks due west and increased speed, hoping to outrun the worst of it. The GPS recalculated slightly, suggesting a minor route correction less than 2 kilometers off the straight line. I thought, no problem. The new path cut through what looked like a dry basin. Flat. Fast. But as the storm picked up, visibility dropped to less than 20 meters. The wind howled like a freight train, and my windows began to rattle with every gust. I kept my foot light on the gas, driving by instinct more than sight. My hands clenched the steering wheel. This was no longer routine. The GPS was flickering, losing signal in bursts. I kept one eye on the blinking display, another on the road that no longer existed in front of me. And then came the crunch. The hillocks jolted hard, the front right wheel sinking deep into a pit of soft sand. I slammed the brakes, too late. The momentum dragged the rear wheels into the trap too. I killed the engine, cursing under my breath. The wind was howling louder now. Sand scraping the windows like nails on glass. I tried to reverse. Wheels spun. The engine roared, but the truck didn't move. I was stuck. The beacon. I hit the distress button on the GPS unit, but it blinked red. No satellite lock. I held it up through the window, trying to boost the signal. Nothing. I reset the device. Still nothing. The wind outside screamed in my ears. I reached into the back seat and grabbed my goggles and scarf. I had to get out and assess the damage. Opening the door was like lifting a wall of wind. Sand poured into the cab like water. I stepped out, shielding my face, and immediately my boots sank into the hot grit. I fought through it and crouched to check the tires. Buried. The soft basin had collapsed beneath the weight of the vehicle. The front axle was almost kissing the ground. Panic flickered in my chest. I forced it down. Not yet. I climbed back into the cab, wiped the sweat from my face, and stared ahead. Visibility was now nearly zero. I was alone. Lost. No signal. No way to call for help. And the Sahara had just begun to swallow me. The wind didn't stop. It only got worse. The sandstorm screamed like a living creature, slamming against the hillocks as if trying to shake me loose from the cab. I sat motionless in the driver's seat, engine off, hands still on the wheel, staring into the milky yellow void outside. It was like being inside a snow globe filled with fire. Every second grain scraped against the glass, hissing, whispering, trying to get in. I knew desert storms could last hours. Sometimes even days. But I hadn't expected one out here, not this strong, not this sudden. The forecast had mentioned only mild winds, typical weather for the Sahara in early spring. But this was different. Angry. Wild. I tried the GPS beacon again, holding it up like some kind of relic, praying it would blink green and tell me someone, somewhere, could hear me. Still red. Still no satellite lock. No signal. No map. No help. I turned around in the seat and looked through the sand-coated back window. The trail I'd driven, my tire marks had already vanished beneath the rising drifts. The desert was erasing me. I had to do something. Grabbing my goggles and scarf again, I wrapped my face tightly and climbed back out into the chaos. The wind punched me in the chest. My feet immediately sank into the soft, dry basin sand, looser than the packed desert roads I'd been following earlier. It was obvious now that I had made a serious mistake turning into this area. I crouched down by the front tire again. Completely buried. Rear wheels too. The hillocks had sunk nearly to the chassis. The storm had done the rest, piling up grain by grain, minute by minute, like an invisible grave digger. I popped the back hatch and grabbed the folding spade, digging at the wheels with gritted teeth. Each shovelful was a fight. The wind threw half of it back in my face. Still, I dug. I wedged the rubber floor mats under the tires, then tried to rock the vehicle by shifting from reverse to drive, tapping the accelerator lightly. The wheels spun, kicked up clouds of dust, and nothing. No movement. The engine groaned and began to heat up. I turned it off again, not wanting to blow the radiator. I sat back in the seat, breathing heavily. Sweat clung to my back like wet plastic. My throat was dry even though I'd sipped water not long ago. I was trapped. I knew the first rule of desert survival: don't panic. Stay with the vehicle. It's easier to spot from the air. It offers shade. It's your lifeline. But if I couldn't get it free, I'd have to break that rule. I looked over the dashboard, watching the sand collect on the windshield. Every instinct was yelling at me to make a plan, to do something, but the truth was I had already made a mistake hours ago. It began with that slight deviation on the GPS route, that minor correction. The satellite images hadn't shown just how unstable this terrain was. The worst part? I didn't even know how far off course I was now. I had no signal, no map, no direction. I could be 5 kilometers off the route or 50. And in the Sahara, 5 kilometers could mean life or death. I forced myself to calm down. Focus. Think. I reached for my logbook and made a rough sketch of where I believed I had traveled from. The base was northeast. The tower, southwest. I had turned slightly west to avoid the storm. If I could just wait it out and get my bearings. The storm began to soften in the late afternoon. The sky brightened to a burnt gold, and visibility increased slightly enough to see the nearest dune ridges again. The air was still filled with dust, but I could at least stand outside without being blinded. That's when I saw it. Not far off, maybe 200 meters to the west, a strange, jagged shape poked through the sand like a bony finger. A rock formation? A collapsed structure? I grabbed my binoculars and squinted. It was an old radio tower. Not the one I was assigned to, but a much older, rust-covered relic of the past, half buried in the shifting dunes. Abandoned. But it meant something crucial. There had been people here. Maybe a path. Maybe even a trail of settlements or installations long forgotten by the company's new digital maps. Excitement sparked in my chest. If I could get there, maybe find higher ground or a better view of the surrounding area. I could reorient myself. Maybe even find a backup power source to boost the GPS beacon or shelter supplies left behind. I packed a small kit, 2 water bottles, my flashlight, folding knife, flare, and radio, and set out on foot, walking against the breeze. The sand was loose and heavy. Each step dragged like I was walking through a sea of gravel. I wrapped my scarf tight and trudged forward. The closer I got, the clearer it became. The old tower was bent at the top, one of its support cables snapped and fluttering in the wind. Birds had nested in the upper beams. I circled it slowly, searching for anything usable. A steel ladder was still intact, partially rusted but stable enough to climb. I ascended carefully, each rung groaning under my weight. When I reached the top, I was just high enough to see over the lowest dunes. And what I saw chilled me. Endless desert. No roads. No tire tracks. No towers. No help. I had turned farther off course than I realized. The route I was supposed to take must have curved south, and I had gone west. Maybe even southwest. The storm had disoriented me, and my trust in the malfunctioning GPS had sealed it. I climbed down, heart pounding harder now, not from effort, but from realization. I wasn't just stuck. I was lost. The sun was starting to set. I needed to get back to the hillocks before nightfall. Even a few hundred meters could become a deadly maze after dark. I followed my footprints carefully, marking my trail with stones along the way. When I reached the vehicle, I crawled inside and shut the door. Everything was quiet now. Too quiet. The wind had died. The Sahara had gone still. And somewhere out there, beneath the same darkening sky, my intended path lay lost beneath 100,000 grains of sand. Morning came, not with the sunrise, but with a dull orange haze that blanketed everything in a thin veil of dust. I'd barely slept, maybe an hour or two, curled up on the passenger seat, arms wrapped around my pack like a life vest. The hillocks had turned into a furnace the moment the sun crested the horizon. Even with all the windows cracked open, the air inside was stifling. My mouth was bone dry, and my limbs ached from the awkward position I'd slept in. I sat up slowly and looked around through the dusty windshield. The storm had passed completely. The world was still, hauntingly so. The sand had shifted, sculpting new shapes across the landscape during the night. My own tire tracks were gone again, obliterated. It was like I had never arrived here at all. Just me, the vehicle, and a wilderness older than history. I slid out of the cab and stood in the hot morning silence. The breeze was gentle, the air dry, and already the heat was rising fast. I took a few moments to stretch, then downed a quarter bottle of water in controlled sips. Couldn't waste it, not now. I had a little under 7 liters left. If I was careful, I could stretch that for, maybe 5 days. That wasn't comforting, considering I had no idea how far I was from the tower, the base, or anything human. My first priority was to get the hillocks moving. If I could just free it, I could backtrack toward higher ground and try again to re-establish GPS or radio contact. I'd had bad terrain before and made it out. This didn't have to be a death sentence. Not yet. I grabbed the shovel and started clearing out the tires again. The sand was packed tight now, like dry cement around the wheels. I worked in slow bursts, pausing every few minutes to wipe my forehead and breathe. Sweat came easily but didn't cool me, it just evaporated, leaving behind a sticky, salty layer on my skin. After almost an hour of digging, I was able to expose enough of the front and rear wheels to try something different. I pulled the rubber floor mats from the cab and wedged them behind the tires again. Then I jacked the car up slightly on one side, just enough to level the chassis off the sand. I wasn't sure if it would work, but it was worth a try. I climbed into the seat, took a breath, and turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, then caught. A moment of hope. I shifted into reverse, gently pressed the gas. The tires turned, grinding, struggling. For one breathless moment, the car rocked backward slightly, just an inch. Then the mat slipped out from under the tires. The wheels spun violently, throwing sand in all directions. The engine roared, but I wasn't going anywhere. I slammed the steering wheel in frustration, cursing aloud. The vehicle had sunken too deep, the sand too soft. I could already hear the radiator struggling with the heat. I turned it off again to avoid engine damage. I was stuck. Completely. I stood outside, staring at the hillocks like it had betrayed me. The once mighty beast that had carried me across thousands of kilometers now sat like a beached whale, its tires choked with sand and sun. This vehicle had everything: tools, supplies, gear. But it couldn't move. That made it a coffin. Or a shelter. The realization came quickly. If I couldn't move it, I could live out of it. For a few days, at least. Maybe longer if I stretched things carefully. The hillocks had power. Solar charger on the dash. A battery bank. A working lighter socket. I could use the tools inside to survive, maybe even to rig a signal if the beacon remained down. But I needed to prepare. The desert was only going to get harsher. I opened the hood and checked the engine. Radiator was hot but undamaged. Battery connections intact. Diesel tank still full. That much was a relief. Then I opened the rear storage and took stock again. Water, 6.75 liters. Food, enough for 4 days at most, maybe less if I kept up this physical labor. Tools, shovel, wrench set, multi-tool, battery inverter. Flashlight, LED, with backup battery. First aid, bandages, painkillers, iodine, sunscreen. Tarp, heavy duty, big enough to use as a sunshade. GPS beacon, still blinking red. Radio, no response, not even static. That last one worried me. No response meant I was too far out or surrounded by terrain that blocked the signal. That small rise with the abandoned tower yesterday? It was probably the highest ground in kilometers. I might have to return to it. I decided to start turning the vehicle into a semi-permanent shelter. I rolled the windows down just enough to let in air but not sand, and used the tarp to build a makeshift awning from the passenger side across the nearest dune slope. I drove the steel pegs into the sand, weighting them down with gear bags and loose rocks. Underneath the tarp, I laid out the floor mats to give me something to sit and sleep on. It wasn't much, but it gave me shade. And in the Sahara, shade is life. I sat beneath the tarp, sweat dripping down my neck, and ate a handful of almonds and a protein bar. It was tasteless, dry, but it filled my stomach. I took another measured sip of water. Then I stared out over the endless desert. Eyes scanning for movement. For birds. For footprints. For anything. But there was nothing. Only sand. And silence. That night, the wind returned, not as violent as the storm, but a cold breeze that whispered through the dunes like a ghost. I curled up under the tarp, wrapped in a blanket from the back seat, my hand resting on the crowbar I kept beside me. I fell asleep to the sounds of sand shifting. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I started to wonder how many others had gotten lost out here and never come back. I woke just before dawn, lungs dry, throat tighter than the day before. The cold of the desert night had settled into my bones, despite the blanket. My shoulders ached from the hard sleep on the mat, but at least I'd gotten a few hours of rest. That was more than I could say for the night before. I sat up slowly, rubbing my face. The sky above was turning from black to a deep blue, the stars fading. No birds. No sounds. Just the wind curling softly through the dunes like a whisper. In that moment, the silence felt personal, like the desert was waiting. I opened a fresh water bottle and took 2 careful sips, then screwed the cap tight. I now had just over 6 liters left. Rationed correctly, that meant 3 more days. Maybe 4, if I was smart. If I was lucky. I crawled out from under the tarp and stood barefoot in the soft morning sand. The vehicle sat half buried, a shadow of its former strength. It was still a shelter, yes, but every hour that passed, it felt more like a tomb. It was time to try the beacon again. I walked around to the passenger seat, pulled the GPS unit from the dash, and powered it on. The screen lit up. It blinked. Searching satellites. I held my breath. Still red. No signal. I tilted it, shifted it outside, raised it above my head like an offering to the sky. Nothing. I stepped away from the vehicle and climbed the nearest dune ridge just high enough to give the device a better view of the horizon. I crouched there, watching the small screen flicker, the signal bars bouncing between 1 and none. Then the screen froze. An error message appeared. Beacon malfunction. Recalibrate unit. Signal timeout. No, I muttered, pressing buttons in frustration. I restarted it. Removed the battery. Let it rest. plugged it into the power inverter and charged it again. I even tapped the casing with my knuckles like it might change its mind. But the message wouldn't go away. I had relied on that beacon. Trusted it. It was supposed to be my guardian angel in places like this. It was made for military-grade emergencies. And now it had turned into a worthless brick. I tossed it onto the passenger seat and leaned against the side of the vehicle. The steel was already warming with the morning heat. It wasn't even 8 a.m. yet. That left the radio. I hadn't tested it since yesterday, hoping maybe the storm interference had blocked the frequencies. I fired it up, tuned across every band I knew. Company frequency. Civilian emergency bands. Local frequencies used by nomadic convoys and old petroleum crews. All I got was silence. Not even static, just a lifeless hum. I opened the panel and checked the wiring. All connected. Battery power was flowing fine. I used the multimeter to test the current. Voltage levels were slightly low, but not enough to prevent broadcast. It wasn't the radio. It was me. I was too far out. No signal. No range. No connection. I was a ghost in the sand. I stood beside the hillocks, arms crossed, listening to the wind and my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I was losing options. I was losing time. I needed a plan. I returned to my sketchbook and traced a new map. I marked the old tower I'd found yesterday, then drew a wide arc in the direction I had originally meant to travel, based on sun position and route estimation. I still believed the new tower, Station B17, was somewhere southwest of my current location. Maybe 20 or 30 kilometers away. That could be a full day's walk, maybe more depending on the terrain. But I didn't dare go now. Not without more information. Not without certainty. I needed height. I needed signal. I needed a miracle. Then a crazy idea hit me. The car battery. The antenna. And the drone rotor. I had a small drone in my gear bag used to photograph tower damage from above without climbing. It wasn't military grade, but it had a decent altitude range. It was dead, though drained during a calibration flight last week and never recharged. But I could power it. Maybe not for a full flight, but long enough to send it 30-40 meters into the air with the beacon strapped to it. If the altitude helped, I might get one clean transmission burst. I got to work immediately. I disassembled the drone housing, removed its camera mount, and created a makeshift platform using aluminum strips from the toolbox. I duct taped the GPS beacon to the platform, carefully insulating it from vibration. Then I rigged a connection to the vehicle's battery, using a voltage converter to match the drone's charging requirement. A slow charge would take hours, but I didn't have that luxury. Instead, I overcharged it. Dangerous. Maybe. Necessary. Absolutely. By noon, the drone was ready. I waited until the sun was directly overhead, maximum visibility for satellites. Then I positioned the drone on a flat spot in front of the hillocks, plugged the beacon in, and launched. The rotor whirred, stuttered, then lifted. Up, up, up until it was barely more than a dot. I stared at the beacon display through binoculars as it climbed. It blinked yellow. Then green. My heart leapt. Green. It caught a satellite. The signal lasted less than 30 seconds before the battery failed and the drone spiraled back down, crashing softly into a nearby dune. I sprinted over and retrieved the beacon. But the green light was gone. No confirmation. No signal log. No message sent. It wasn't enough. I was still alone. I stood in the empty sand, looking at the broken drone, the sun baking the top of my head, and the desert around me that didn't care if I lived or died. And for the first time since this began, I felt afraid. The sun disappeared like a coin sinking into a sea of fire. It didn't slowly dip behind hills or mountains, it just vanished behind the dunes with a suddenness that felt unnatural. In the desert, there's no twilight. 1 minute it's blazing daylight, the next, darkness creeps in like smoke. Fast. Cold. Silent. I crouched beneath the tarp shelter I'd built beside the hillocks, arms wrapped around my knees, eyes flicking between the last rays of light and the horizon beyond. Nothing moved. Not even the wind. Just that heavy silence pressing in again, like I was deep underwater. I checked my water, 5 full bottles remained. I allowed myself 3 mouthfuls. Not enough to quench the thirst, but enough to keep my tongue from cracking. I chewed on a few dried figs, swallowed slowly, and laid the rest of the food back into the crate. Rationing was key now. If I ran out before I found a way out of this, I might as well dig my own grave. The sand was cooling rapidly. Heat fled the surface the moment the sun vanished. Within an hour, it would be close to freezing. Most people think the Sahara is just about the heat, but that's only half the nightmare. The cold comes hard and fast. And it cuts deep. I layered on everything I had: a jacket, a scarf, even wrapped my legs in the tarp's edge like a sleeping bag. It wasn't enough, but it would have to do. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, distant, sharp, carried on the still night air. I froze. My ears strained for a pattern. Again the sound echoed faintly from behind a dune. It was a yipping noise. Not the wind. Not mechanical. Organic. Wild. Jackals. They were common in this part of the desert, scavengers, usually traveling in small packs, active at night. They weren't large enough to be lethal to a human, unless you were weak, asleep, bleeding, or alone. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I grabbed my crowbar and flashlight, slowly turning off the tarp light to avoid drawing attention. The flashlight beam pierced the dark, sweeping across the dunes. Nothing. Just long shadows and the ripple of sand. But I knew they were there. I could smell it, that mix of dry fur and instinct. They were watching, waiting. Probably could smell the food, the water, me. I backed into the vehicle, closed the doors, and locked them. The cab was warmer, but not by much. It was tight, dry, and smelled like dust and fear. I sat in the driver's seat, crowbar across my lap, and rested my forehead on the wheel. My whole body ached. The back of my neck was sunburnt, and the cold air made it sting like an open wound. I closed my eyes, trying to gather strength, trying to remember my training. The human body can survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water. The mind, not so long without hope. I couldn't afford to break. Not yet. I thought about my daughter, Salma. 11 years old. Loved stars and airplanes. She used to beg me to bring home satellite pictures or drone footage from the towers I worked on. I pictured her face, big brown eyes, always curious, always asking questions. I wondered what she'd think if she saw me now, bundled in my own tarp, crowbar clutched like a weapon, hiding from jackals. Would she be scared? Or proud? I decided to hold on to that image. Her, sitting on the rooftop back home, waiting for me to return. That would be my anchor. My reason. I opened the door quietly a few hours later to check outside. The moon had risen pale, high, and sharp-edged. The dunes cast long shadows. The sand shimmered like crushed bone. Eerie and beautiful. And there, about 30 meters from the vehicle, I saw them. 2 jackals. Slender. Pale. Their eyes glowed silver blue in the moonlight. One sniffed the sand, the other watched me. They didn't come closer. Not yet. But they knew I was here. And they were patient. I threw a small stone toward them. They flinched and backed up, but didn't run. Predators. Testing boundaries. I shut the door again. Sleep came in waves that night, light, fragmented. I drifted off for 10 minutes at a time, then snapped awake at the slightest sound. Once, I swore I heard something brush against the vehicle's side, but when I looked, there was nothing. At some point, maybe 2, maybe 3 in the morning, I stepped out to relieve myself. The air had dropped to near freezing. I could see my breath in the moonlight. My boots crunched lightly over the sand, now hardened by the cold. And that's when I saw something strange. Tracks. Not mine. They led up to the passenger side of the vehicle, then back toward the dunes. Fresh. Small. Too large for rodents. Too straight for wind. They'd come closer than I thought. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the cab, flashlight off, gripping the crowbar until my knuckles ached, staring into the night and listening to the desert breathe. The sun would rise in a few hours. And I'd have to start making real choices. The morning sun hit hard. No slow, gentle warmth, just a sudden blast of heat that made my skin tighten and my lips sting. I was already awake when the first light spilled over the dunes. I hadn't really slept. Just drifted in and out of shallow dozes, gripping my crowbar, listening for jackals, imagining things in the dark. By sunrise, they were gone. Just a few fading paw prints near the rear tire as proof they had been there at all. I stepped outside slowly, bones stiff, muscles aching. The tarp shelter I'd set up the day before had survived the night. One corner had come loose, flapping gently in the breeze, but otherwise it held. I tightened the guy lines with my tool rope, drove the steel stakes deeper with the crowbar, and adjusted the shade. Every inch of protection against the sun counted. Then I got to work. It was time to make an honest assessment of what I had and what I could use. The hillox wasn't going anywhere, that much was certain. It was too deep in the basin, tires almost entirely buried, the soft sand swallowing it more with each passing hour. I had no winch, no second vehicle, no slope to back down from. The more I looked at it, the more I saw it not as transportation but as a bunker. A fragile one. I laid everything I had out in the shade of the tarp, organizing it like I'd learned in training. Visual inventory. Realistic thinking. Water. 5 full bottles, 750 ml each, equals 3.75 liters. 1/2 full bottle equals 0.375 liters. Total, 4.1 liters. If I rationed strictly 250 ml per day, I could last 6 more days. Maybe 7. But that was without accounting for exertion. Walking in the desert, climbing dunes, exposure. It dropped to 3 days. 4. Max. Food. 2 protein bars. Half bag of dates. 1 vacuum-sealed ration pack, beef and rice. A bag of almonds, about 2 handfuls. Enough for 3 full meals, if I was strict. I could stretch it into 5 smaller ones if I skipped a meal each day. But energy was critical. Especially if I planned to walk. Tools and gear. Shovel. Crowbar. Duct tape, half roll. 2 knives, 1 folding, 1 fixed. LED flashlight, 2 spare batteries. First aid kit, minimal, but functional. Tarp and rope. Solar phone charger. GPS beacon, still non-functional. Radio, dead zone. Fire starter. A few flares, signal, not explosive. Electronics. My phone completely useless now, no signal, just a digital notepad and clock. GPS worthless unless I could find high ground. Drone damaged from the beacon test, motor burned out. Battery pack half full. I looked at it all and realized the truth. I was well prepared for a short-term emergency. Not this. Not 5 days in the middle of nowhere with no working GPS, no radio, no road, and no clear direction. I'd already used my best tool, the drone beacon signal, and it had failed. I sat down in the shade, took 1 mouthful of water, and let it sit in my mouth before swallowing. Then I started thinking like a survivor. What could I make? What could I use? I took a hacksaw from the toolbox and began cutting off the Hilix's passenger side mirror. Once free, I cleaned it and set it aside. A signaling device. Next, I removed both sun visors. They were light and reflective, good for making emergency flags or building insulation. The roof lining. Insulating material. The seat covers. Fabric. I even started thinking about siphoning fuel to build a fire if I needed smoke. Everything had to serve a new purpose now. The vehicle was no longer transport. It was a carcass to be cannibalized. I scavenged what I could from the interior: clips, wiring, plastic panels, even the dome light housing. Then I turned to the rear cargo area. The crate where I kept the tools became my new supply chest, repacked and arranged. The jack handle could double as a walking stick. A wrench might work as a hammer. By noon, I had a full kit laid out: survival pack version 2. Smaller, lighter, mobile. Because a thought had taken root in my mind. a thought I'd been avoiding since the GPS failed. What if I had to walk? I didn't like it. Every instinct told me to stay with the vehicle. It offered shade, structure, a place for potential rescue to find me. But no one knew I was here. My signal never sent. The storm had blown me far off my expected path. If my team was searching, they'd be looking along the GPS trail, not here. Not 30 kilometers off. I was invisible. And if I stayed invisible, I would die. That left one option. I needed to start planning a trek. Not today. I was still too weak, too uncertain. But maybe tomorrow or the day after early morning, with supplies, heading in the direction of the old tower first, then on toward any sign of civilization. Water. Life. But before I could even begin that journey, I needed one more thing. I needed a direction. With no GPS, I would have to navigate by the sun, the stars, and memory. I would need a compass. Which meant I had to make one. That night, after eating half a protein bar and sipping the last of one water bottle, I used a strip of wire, a magnet from a speaker, and a shallow lid filled with water to make a crude floating compass. The wire aligned slowly. North. Then I stared at the map I had sketched in my notebook again. Tower B17 should be southwest of my position. If I could find a hill or even a tall dune and walk by compass, there might still be hope. But it would be dangerous. And if I chose wrong, it might be my last step. I lay down under the tarp that night, staring up at the sky as it exploded into a sea of stars. So clear. So cold. So far from home. By the fourth morning, the desert felt quieter than ever. Too quiet. The wind hadn't picked up at all since midnight. No howling gusts, no shifting sand. Just stillness. The kind that presses against your ears until even your own breath sounds intrusive. I'd survived another night under the tarp, barely sleeping, eyes open half the time, flashlight in one hand, crowbar in the other. I hadn't seen the jackals again, but I could still sense them like they were watching from just beyond the dunes, waiting for me to make a mistake. But today, I wasn't waiting for them. Today, I was moving. Not a full trek, not yet, but I needed to scout. I needed to look for signs of life. Or better yet, water. Even a small pool, even moisture under a rock could mean the difference between making it out or not. I packed lightly for the day. Water bottle, crowbar, compass, flashlight, mirror, knife, and a strip of red cloth torn from the vehicle seat to use as a trail marker if I had to double back. I strapped the crowbar across my back using wire and a bungee cord. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept my hands free. I left the tarp tied up, tucked the remaining gear into the vehicle, and set out. West-southwest. Following the bearing I'd chosen the night before using the makeshift compass. The sand burned beneath my boots even in early morning. The dunes shimmered with heat already. My jacket, wrapped tight to shield my arms, was soaked with sweat within the first 15 minutes. I kept my mouth closed, breathing through my nose to conserve moisture. I climbed the first rise slowly, each step sinking, legs aching. At the crest, I paused, shielding my eyes with my hand. The view from the top was endless. Waves of sand rolling on forever, like the world had frozen in mid-storm. But something caught my eye to the south. Dark patches. Not rocks. Brush. Scrub vegetation clinging to the base of a slope maybe 2 kilometers away. It was faint, barely visible, but real. Where there are plants, there's moisture. Maybe not drinkable water, but moisture is life. Animals follow it. Birds. Insects. People. I pressed on. It took me nearly an hour to reach the spot, descending and ascending dunes, each one steeper than the last. My legs burned. My breathing grew louder. I forced myself to take slow sips from the water bottle. Just enough to wet my mouth. Never too much. At last, I reached the base of a dune where the brush grew in tight, thorny clusters. Low to the ground, brittle looking, but alive. I knelt and pushed aside the branches. Sand was packed tight around their roots. No standing water, but the soil was cooler. Damp beneath the surface. I dug a small hole and pressed my palm into it. Yes. Moisture. Too little to drink. But enough to know I wasn't entirely alone out here. Then I noticed something more interesting: tracks. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. Worn, partial, half covered by drifted sand, but unmistakable. The tread was thin, almost military. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Someone had walked through here. I followed the tracks as best I could. They led around the base of the dune, winding between patches of vegetation. Here and there, I saw more signs: scuffed sand, a broken stick, a torn bit of cloth fluttering on a branch. The prints eventually vanished where the wind had swept the trail clean, but by then, I'd seen what I needed to. Humans had passed here. And if they had, there might be more. A route. A camp. A well. My pulse quickened at the thought. I searched the area further, looking for signs of habitation. A fire pit. Trash. Tools. Anything. I didn't find a well or campsite. But I did find something valuable: a rusted, hollow metal drum tucked into the base of a shaded rock overhang. It had no markings, no lid, and it was empty. But it wasn't from nature. It was placed there. Someone had once stored something here. I sat beside it, collecting my thoughts. The sun was rising higher, and the heat was becoming unbearable. My skin felt like it was cooking. Time to return. But not empty-handed. I had another idea, one I'd been holding in reserve. Solar still. I tore one of the side window's sunshades from the vehicle earlier and brought it with me. I placed it across a wide, shallow hole I dug in the sand beneath the brush, laying it tight like a dome. In the center, I suspended a small plastic cup using a twisted bit of wire. Then I weighted the center of the sheet with a pebble. If the soil held moisture, the heat would cause it to evaporate, condense on the plastic, and drip into the cup. A few hours might give me a few sips. I left it behind, marked the location with 3 stones, and began the trek back. The return was brutal. The heat pressed down like a blanket of iron. My legs felt like rubber. The dunes looked identical. At one point, I nearly veered east instead of north, saved only by the sun's angle and the crude compass. My lips were cracked. My eyes burned. But when I crested the final dune and saw the tarp and the hillocks below, I felt a surge of relief. Like returning to a familiar world. I stumbled under the tarp, dropped to my knees, and took a sip of water. Then I smiled. There was life out there. Human tracks, moisture. Maybe even help. And now, for the first time since the storm, I had direction. Tomorrow, I would go farther. And I would follow those tracks wherever they led. Off toward the unknown. Let me know when you're ready. The night after my scouting mission was restless, but different. Not filled with fear or loneliness, but with a flicker of hope and the heavy weight of decisions to come. I lay under the tarp, staring up at the vast, glittering stars overhead. The desert's cold was biting now, but beneath it all, I felt a quiet determination settle inside me. The faint trail of boot prints I'd found earlier meant I wasn't alone out here. Someone or something had passed through. Maybe they were close. Maybe they could help. But it also meant I had to move. The vehicle was my fortress, but it was also my prison. Stuck, buried, useless as transport. If I stayed, I might be stranded until rescue came, or until I ran out of water and died. If I left, I risked everything: dehydration, disorientation, exhaustion. But I had to try. Morning came fast. I unpacked my survival gear and began to plan. First, water. The solar still I'd set up yesterday beneath the scrub brush might give me a small amount of condensation if the sun stayed strong. I didn't expect much, maybe a few milliliters to keep my mouth wet. But every drop counted. I'd also collected the sun visors and mirror from the hillocks, along with a few plastic bottles, some duct tape, and wire. I sat on the dune with my tools, trying to figure out how to make a better water collector, something light enough to carry but efficient enough to catch moisture overnight. I fashioned a simple funnel from a cut plastic bottle, attaching it to a small container to catch drips. Using the reflective mirror, I angled sunlight to focus on a blackened metal canister from the truck's toolbox, hoping to warm it and aid evaporation in a tiny, portable distillation system. It wasn't much. It wouldn't save me by itself. But it was something. Next, I stripped more useful parts from the vehicle. The roof lining was torn out and folded into a makeshift bundle. Seat cushions provided padding for my backpack. I even removed the vehicle's rear-view mirror, small, sharp edges perfect for signaling or for use as a tool. My clothes were filthy, caked with dust and sweat. I found a fresh scarf in the glove compartment and wrapped it tightly around my neck to shield against the sun and sand. Food was rationed strictly. Half a protein bar and a few almonds in the morning, and the rest reserved for when I really needed energy. I packed everything into the backpack, ensuring it was as light as possible. Before leaving, I set a clear marker near the tarp, a bright orange strip of cloth tied high on a stick so that if rescue teams came near, they might spot it. I checked my compass once more, tracing the southwest bearing toward the old tower and the scrub brush where I'd found tracks. The sun was high. It was time. I took one last sip of water, pulled the scarf up over my face, and hoisted the backpack on my shoulders. My legs were stiff and sore, but my mind was sharp. I told myself to keep calm, stay hydrated, and rest whenever the sun was harshest. Step by step, I began walking. The sand was loose and deep. Each step felt like a battle, but the weight of the backpack reminded me why I was moving. Survival. I used the mirror and the orange cloth as signaling devices. If I saw any planes or distant figures, I'd flash sunlight or wave cloth frantically. Hours passed with nothing but dunes. The heat was punishing. Sweat poured, drying quickly. My mouth was a desert inside my mouth, cracked and bitter. I took small, measured sips from the water bottle, barely enough to wet my lips. As the sun moved west, I spotted a strange silhouette ahead, a rocky outcrop rising above the dunes. It looked like a natural fortress. I headed toward it, hoping for shade, water, or even shelter. When I reached it, I found the remains of an old stone structure, half buried in sand and wind-eroded. Its walls were crumbling but still stood tall enough to block the sun. Inside the ruins, I found broken pottery shards and fragments of a rusty metal bucket likely left behind by travelers or past inhabitants. I took a moment to rest in the shade, drinking a little water, eating a handful of almonds. From this high ground, I could see farther. Dunes stretched endlessly south and west, but beyond them, a faint plume of smoke rose thin, wispy, and pale against the desert sky. Smoke. Human smoke. My heart leapt. Could it be a camp? A community? Help. I took out my notebook and sketched the smoke's direction carefully, marking it as a possible destination. I couldn't be sure if it was recent, or just a trick of the light, but hope was a powerful fuel. I set off again, moving toward the smoke's source, keeping my pace steady but cautious. The desert was merciless, and I knew the nights would be colder, the water scarcer. But I also knew this: I wasn't lost anymore. I had a direction. I had a reason. I was still alive. The desert heat pressed down relentlessly, but the plume of smoke I'd seen from the rocky ruins burned brighter in my mind than the sun overhead. It was a sign, a beacon of hope that propelled me forward with every aching step. The sand shifted beneath my boots as I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, scanning for any new signs of life or shelter. My water supply was dwindling, and the weight of the backpack felt heavier with every mile, but I told myself the smoke meant water, food, people, rescue. By midday, the sun was merciless. I had learned to walk slow and steady during the hottest hours, resting in any scant shadow I could find. Shielding my face with the scarf, and sipping sparingly from my water bottle. My lips were cracked and dry, and my skin felt raw, but I pushed on. The terrain grew rougher as I approached a jagged ridge rising out of the dunes. The smoke was clearer now, a thin spiral that twisted against the sky. I climbed toward the ridge, searching for a vantage point. Reaching the crest, I paused to catch my breath and surveyed the land below. There, nestled between two rocky outcrops, was a small settlement, a cluster of tents and stone huts surrounded by a scattering of palms. A handful of figures moved about, tending to fires and animals. The sight made my heart pound. I was not alone anymore. I considered my options. Approaching strangers in the desert was risky. They might be friendly, or they might see me as a threat. But my body was weak, my water nearly gone. I needed help. I found a large flat rock and rested in the shade, watching the settlement from a distance. Gathering my courage, I took the mirror from my pack and sent a few quick flashes toward the camp, hoping to signal my presence. After a tense moment, a figure raised their arm in acknowledgement. Relief flooded through me. I rose slowly, walking carefully down the ridge toward the camp, every sense alert. As I neared, a small group gathered, eyes wide and curious. One of them stepped forward, a man in traditional desert robes, his face weathered but kind. "Welcome, traveler," he said in a measured tone, "you are far from your path." "I am lost," I replied hoarsely, "my vehicle broke down. I have been wandering for days." He nodded, signaling to others who brought me water and food. The sweet taste of water was overwhelming, and the simple meal warmed my body and spirit. They told me their community had lived here for generations, surviving the harsh desert through knowledge of water sources and the land. As night fell, I sat among them, save for the first time in days, my heart heavy but hopeful. The desert night wrapped around us like a vast, dark blanket studded with stars. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was surrounded by people alive, moving, breathing. The warmth of their campfires cast flickering shadows against the rugged stone huts, and the soft murmur of voices offered a strange comfort. The man who first welcomed me introduced himself as Hassan. He was tall, lean, with a face etched by sun and sand, his eyes sharp but kind. "You have endured much," he said quietly as we sat near the fire. "You are welcome here." They brought me water, fresh and cool, from a well they called the Hidden Spring. The taste was like life itself, washing away the dryness that had clung to my throat for days. I drank slowly, careful not to overdo it, knowing too much too fast could be dangerous. A woman named Layla approached, her eyes bright and curious. She brought a plate of dried dates, flat bread, and goat cheese. The food was simple but nourishing, and I ate with gratitude. As I ate, I explained what had happened: the storm, the vehicle stuck in the sand, the failed GPS, my desperate search for help. They listened patiently, nodding. Hassan shared that their community was small but self-sufficient, living off the land and knowledge passed down through generations. They had wells hidden beneath the desert floor and knew where to find water even in the harshest conditions. I asked about their way of life, their routines, and the dangers of the desert. "Many have come before you," Hassan said softly. "Some stay, some leave. The desert is unforgiving, but it gives to those who respect it." I spent the night in a small stone hut, a rough mattress of woven palm fibers beneath me. My body ached, but I slept deeply, the first real rest since the storm. When morning came, I was introduced to the other members of the community: shepherds, craftsmen, and nomads who had made this oasis their home. They welcomed me with quiet smiles and wary glances. Layla showed me the water system, a deep well lined with stone, fed by underground springs, carefully protected from evaporation. She explained how they harvested dates from the palms and raised goats for milk and meat. I realized how fragile and precious this way of life was, balanced on knowledge and respect for the desert. As the day wore on, Hassan offered to help me repair my vehicle, or at least salvage parts for my journey. "We have tools and skills," he said. "If you choose to leave, we will prepare you." I nodded, grateful beyond words. For the first time in days, hope sparked inside me. The sun was fierce that morning, but inside the shelter of the desert community, a quiet energy hummed. After days of wandering, thirst, and uncertainty, the feeling of having people around who understood the desert, and who offered help without question, was like a balm to my soul. Hassan had gathered a small group of men who were skilled with tools, mechanics, and crafting. They spoke a mix of Arabic and Berber, but spoke enough English for me to get by. Layla translated when needed, her soft voice bridging our worlds. "We will try to repair your vehicle," Hassan said as we approached the battered hillocks. "It will not be easy. The desert has taken its toll." The vehicle looked worse than I remembered. Sand coated every inch. The tires were nearly buried, one rim bent badly from the fall into the basin. The engine bay was filled with dust and sand, and the wiring had clearly been damaged by the storm and heat. But there was determination in the eyes of these men. Tools were produced: wrenches, screwdrivers, welding equipment, and even a small generator powered by solar panels they had arranged nearby. I felt a surge of hope. We started by digging around the tires to free the vehicle from the soft sand. Shovels and hands worked together, uncovering the wheels carefully. Hassan showed me how to use planks of palm wood placed under the tires to improve traction. Meanwhile, a mechanic named Samir examined the engine. "Electrical systems are fried," he said bluntly, pointing to melted wires and corroded connectors. "Fuel system clogged with sand and debris." I showed them the GPS beacon and radio, explaining how the beacon had failed and how I'd tried to get a signal with the drone. "We can fix some of this," Hassan promised. "But the desert is a harsh teacher. Sometimes, you learn to survive with less." Over the next few hours, we dismantled parts of the engine and rewired sections as best as possible. Samir fashioned a makeshift antenna from scrap metal and wiring to improve radio range, and Hassan wrapped the GPS unit in protective cloth to shield it from dust and heat. The men worked with a patient efficiency that I admired. Their knowledge of the desert wasn't just survival, it was mastery of adaptation. Every spare part, every scrap of metal was precious. By midday, the engine sputtered to life. Coughing and grinding but alive. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "We will test it soon," Hassan said cautiously. "But you will still need water and food. The journey back will not be easy." I nodded, feeling both relief and the weight of what lay ahead. That evening, Layla brought me a bowl of lentil soup, fragrant with spices I hadn't tasted in days. I ate slowly, savoring the warmth and comfort of community. We talked around the fire, sharing stories, hers of life in the desert, mine of a world far away, filled with towers and technology. She told me about the harshness of the desert winds, the seasonal floods, and the delicate balance they maintained with nature. I shared what I knew of the cities, the networks of towers I'd inspected, and how sometimes even the most advanced technology could fail. The desert had humbled me. That night, As I lay on the woven mattress, I realized I wasn't just physically healed here, something deeper was shifting. The isolation, the desperation, the fight for survival had carved away pieces of my old self. What remained was raw and real. I knew the road ahead would be tough, but I felt stronger. Not just because of water or food or shelter, but because I had been reminded what it meant to be human, to rely on others, to adapt, to hope. The next morning, Hassan and Samir gathered supplies for the journey back: extra water containers, food rations, and tools. They showed me how to read the desert signs, the angle of the sun, the shape of the dunes, the plants that indicated water nearby. We packed the hillocks carefully, loading everything I might need. Before I left, Hassan clasped my shoulder firmly. The desert tests every man who crosses it. You have endured. Now, go home. I nodded, gratitude welling in my chest. As I drove away from the community, the sun low in the sky, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Layla and Hassan standing together, watching. I wasn't lost anymore. The engine's steady rumble beneath me felt foreign, almost a luxury after days of trudging across the merciless sand. Yet, with every slow, labored turn of the wheels, I felt the weight of all I'd endured settle deeper into my bones. The desert was still vast, still unforgiving, and the journey back was far from over. Hassan's community had gifted me more than water and food. They'd given me knowledge, the kind that no map or GPS could provide. Before leaving, Hassan had taken time to teach me how to read the desert's subtle language, the way the sand shifts with the wind, how plants signaled nearby water, how the sun's position marked direction even on cloudy days. I had a compass and a roughly repaired GPS, but I learned to trust my own senses. The first few kilometers were the hardest. The soft sand grabbed the tires, threatening to swallow the vehicle whole. I followed the tracks the community had made, planks of palm wood under the wheels, careful steering to avoid steep dunes. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, sweat mixing with dust. Every now and then, I stopped to check the engine and make sure the wiring held. The makeshift antenna on the radio sat atop the cab, catching the weak signals of the desert's empty airwaves. I hoped one day I'd hear something, a voice, a signal, a sign of life beyond the dunes. The sun rose high and relentless, baking the desert around me. The temperature inside the cab was suffocating, the air thick with dust and heat. I cracked the windows slightly, letting in swirls of hot air that carried the faint scent of dry brush and burnt sand. The terrain grew tougher as I drove farther from the oasis. No more scrub brush or shade, just rolling dunes and barren valleys. But with Hassan's teachings, I knew where to find small signs: a cluster of stones here, a depression in the sand there, markers left by nomads or ancient travelers. At one point, as I navigated a tricky stretch of deep sand, the vehicle faltered and sank into a dune. I jumped out and grabbed the shovel Hassan had lent me. Digging out the tires took nearly an hour under the merciless sun, sweat pouring down my back and burning my eyes. But every challenge I met felt different now, less terrifying, more like a test of will and skill. At night, I camped beside the vehicle, setting up the tarp and using the reflective mirror to signal any distant planes. The desert nights were cold, the air crisp and sharp as I sat staring at the stars, thinking about my family and how close, yet far, they felt. On the third day, my radio finally crackled to life, faint at first, then clearer. A voice. Emergency frequency. It was weak but unmistakable. I scrambled for the volume knob, my heart pounding. If anyone hears this, this is Desert Rescue Unit, coordinates 27.14 north, 14.08 east, repeat, coordinates 27.14 north, 14.08 east. I grabbed my notebook and scribbled down the coordinates. Hope surged through me like wildfire. With renewed energy, I set the GPS to those coordinates, driving cautiously toward the signal source. The following days blurred a mix of sun, sand, and long hours behind the wheel. Food and water were rationed carefully, every sip and bite calculated to last. The repaired vehicle struggled but held firm. On the fifth day, just as the sun began to dip, I spotted a dust cloud rising in the distance, a convoy of trucks and jeeps, rescue teams moving carefully through the desert. I flipped my mirror, flashing the sun, waving the bright cloth from the side window. The convoy slowed, then stopped. A team approached, armed and cautious but welcoming. I was saved. As they led me to their vehicles, I looked back at the endless desert, the place that had tried to claim me, tested my spirit and will. I thought of the community that had sheltered me, the men and women who had shared their knowledge and kindness. And I thought of home. The desert had changed me. I was no longer just a man lost in the sands, I was a survivor. The convoy's dust cloud approached slowly, like a mirage solidifying into reality. As their vehicles rolled to a stop near my battered hillocks, my heart pounded with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Rescue was no longer a distant hope, it was here. The team's leader, a tall woman with sun-bleached hair and sharp eyes, climbed down from her jeep and extended a hand. "Are you Zach?" she asked, scanning my face for signs of health. "I am," I replied, my voice hoarse and rough from days without proper water. She nodded, then signaled to her team. "Let's get you out of this desert." They helped me into their vehicle, handing me water and food, and began communicating over their radios. The warmth inside the jeep felt strange after the harsh desert air, and as I took a sip of the cold water they offered, tears stung my eyes. I was alive, truly alive. As the convoy rolled away from the dunes, I glanced back at the endless sea of sand stretching behind me. The desert had tested me beyond anything I imagined, stripping me down to raw survival. Every grain of sand, every scorching sunbeam, every cold night under the stars had carved a new version of myself, a survivor, forged in hardship. I tried to explain the journey, the storm that wrecked my vehicle, the endless wandering, the night among jackals, the thirst and hunger that gnawed at my body, the moments of despair and hope. The team listened with quiet respect, their faces etched with admiration. One of the medics checked my vitals and began treating my sunburned skin and dehydration. "You're lucky to be alive," she said softly. "Your story will help others prepare." As the vehicles sped toward the nearest town, I found myself thinking of the desert community that had saved me, Hassan, Layla, Samir, and the others who had taken me in without hesitation. Their knowledge, kindness, and skill had kept me alive long enough for rescue to find me. Without them, I would never have made it. I resolved to return to them someday, to bring supplies or assistance, to repay the debt of survival. Days later, back in civilization, I underwent medical checks and debriefings. Reporters wanted my story, a tale of endurance against the odds. But the story wasn't just about me. It was about the desert, its dangers, and its strange beauty, about the people who live there, guardians of ancient knowledge, about the thin line between survival and surrender. Each night, I relived the desert in my dreams, the vast dunes under the blazing sun, the silence broken by distant jackal calls, the shimmering mirage of hope. And each morning, I woke grateful to be home. My family embraced me with tears and smiles. My daughter, Salma, looked up at me with wide eyes and whispered, "Daddy, you're a hero." I smiled, kissed her forehead, and thought of the desert, its harsh lessons, its unexpected grace. I was a man changed, but not broken. The Sahara had taken much, but it had given me something else, the unshakable will to live, to adapt, and to hope. Back in the cool embrace of civilization, the contrast to the desert was overwhelming. The cold tiles of the hospital floor, the sterile scent of antiseptics, the buzz of fluorescent lights, it all felt so foreign after the endless expanse of sand, sun, and silence. Doctors and nurses surrounded me, gently probing my battered body. The sunburn that blistered my skin stung anew under their touch. My muscles, once taut with tension and adrenaline, now ached deeply, weighed down by exhaustion and dehydration. But the most profound ache wasn't physical, it was a hollow ache inside my chest, the memory of isolation and struggle still fresh. Days of treatment followed, 4 fluids to rehydrate, antibiotics to prevent infection, and wound care to heal the raw skin. Each day, the steady rhythm of medical care was a reminder of how close I'd come to death and how precious life was. Visitors came. My wife, Fatima, her eyes rimmed with tears, held my hand and whispered prayers. My children Salma and little Yusuf brought drawings and gifts, their innocent smiles a balm for my spirit. They listened intently as I shared stories of survival, not the terrifying parts, but the moments of hope, the kindness of strangers, and the lessons the desert had taught me. Though I was home, my mind often drifted back to Hassan, Layla, and the desert community that had saved me. Their selfless hospitality, their deep respect for the harsh land, and the wisdom that kept them alive resonated with me profoundly. I was determined to find a way to repay their kindness. At night, as I lay in the quiet dark of my room, I reflected on the ordeal. The desert was merciless, but it was also beautiful, a vast canvas of endless possibility and profound solitude. It had stripped away distractions, revealing what was essential: resilience, resourcefulness, and connection. I knew that surviving was not enough. I had to heal body, mind, and spirit, and then carry those lessons forward. One afternoon, while reviewing my notes from the desert, I began drafting a plan. I would share my story not just as a tale of survival but as a guide for others who might face the desert's dangers. How to prepare, how to navigate, how to respect and understand this unforgiving land. I reached out to desert survival experts and rescue organizations, hoping to collaborate on educational programs. I also planned to send supplies to Hassan's community: solar-powered radios, medical kits, and durable tools to support the people who had saved my life. The experience had changed me. I was no longer just a bricklayer and inspector, I was a survivor with a mission. Weeks turned into months. Physical scars faded, but the lessons remained vivid. I returned to work, but with a new perspective, grateful for every day, every moment, and every breath. I made a vow to live fully and to honor the desert and its people by sharing their stories and wisdom. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I looked up at the stars and whispered thanks to the vast Sahara that had tested me, broken me, and ultimately made me whole. Returning to daily life was both comforting and strange. The familiar rhythms of family, work, and home felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the desert, yet inside me, something had shifted irrevocably. At work, the towers I once inspected felt different. They weren't just metal structures piercing the sky, they were reminders of connection, communication, and the fragile threads holding the modern world together. I thought often about the lost GPS signals, the failed beacons, and how fragile technology was against the raw forces of nature. My colleagues welcomed me back with curiosity and sympathy, eager to hear my story. I shared what I could: the struggle, the desert's cruelty, and the kindness of strangers who had saved me. But I also spoke about preparedness, how vital it was to respect the environment and be ready for the unexpected. I started to develop training materials for field workers like myself: survival guides, checklists, and videos on desert safety, water sourcing, navigation without tech, and emergency shelter construction. I teamed up with local desert communities and survival experts to bring real knowledge and experience into these resources. At home, I became more present. Every hug, every smile from my children felt precious. I worked hard to balance my physical recovery with my new emotional mission. But the desert called to me still. I reached out to Hassan and Layla, and after some time, arranged to send supplies to their community: solar chargers, medical kits, tools, and food staples. We communicated through Layla, who was eager to learn more about the outside world and share her people's knowledge with mine. Months later, I planned a trip back to the desert, not as a lost man but as a visitor and ally. I wanted to learn from the community directly, to build bridges between our worlds, and to honor the desert's fierce beauty and the people who lived within it. The desert was no longer a place of fear, but of respect. I was ready. The journey back to the desert was a quiet one, filled with anticipation and reflection. The city's noise faded behind me as the landscape shifted from crowded streets to endless horizons of sand and sky. Each mile brought me closer to the community that had saved my life, the place where I had found hope amid despair. When I arrived, Hassan and Layla greeted me warmly. Their smiles were genuine, the kind of welcome reserved for those who had become part of a larger family. The village looked unchanged: the stone huts, the palm trees swaying gently in the desert breeze, the sun casting long shadows over the dunes. But I knew I was different. The days ahead were a blend of learning and teaching. I shared stories of the modern world, the technology and challenges I faced as a tower inspector, while they taught me the intricate rhythms of desert life: the secrets of finding water beneath barren earth, the delicate balance of flora and fauna, and the importance of community in such a harsh environment. We worked side by side, repairing the village's solar panels, reinforcing walls against sandstorms, and planning for the future. I helped introduce new tools and supplies, but always with respect for their traditions and knowledge. At night, we sat around the fire, exchanging stories under the endless canopy of stars. The desert's silence was no longer intimidating, it was sacred. Each story, each laugh, each shared meal deepened the bond between us. I realized that survival was not just about endurance, it was about connection. The desert had taught me that. When it was time to leave, I felt a pang of sorrow but also gratitude. This place, these people, had become part of my story forever. As I drove away, the dunes stretched out before me, vast and timeless. I was no longer lost but rooted in the desert, in myself, and in a community that had opened their arms when I was at my most vulnerable. The desert had changed me, and I was ready to carry its lessons forward. Back in the city once again, the desert's whispers lingered in my mind like a distant song. The vast silence, the blazing sun, the nights lit only by stars, it was a world apart from the bustle of modern life, but it had left a permanent imprint on my soul. I dedicated myself to sharing what I had learned, not just as a survival story but as a message about respect for nature, for knowledge passed down through generations, and for the fragile balance between humans and the environment. I began hosting workshops and training sessions for colleagues and locals who worked in harsh terrains. Using my notes, photos, and sketches, I walked them through desert survival basics: how to read the signs of water, how to make a solar still, how to navigate when GPS fails, and how to prepare for emergencies. I also spoke about the community that had saved me, their resilience, their wisdom, and their generosity. People listened. Many asked questions. Some even volunteered to help send supplies or assist with projects to improve conditions for those desert communities. At home, I found a new sense of purpose. My family supported me through this transformation. My wife Fatima helped organize local events and spread awareness. My children, curious and eager, learned about the desert's beauty and danger, fascinated by the stories I told. One evening, as we sat together watching the sunset, Salma asked, "Dad, will you go back to the desert again?" I smiled, the warmth of the fading sun reflecting in my eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. The desert is part of me now. And I want to help those who live there, just like they helped me." This new mission gave me strength. Though the Sahara had tested me, it had also taught me that survival wasn't just about fighting the elements, it was about community, knowledge, and the will to keep moving forward. And that, I realized, was the greatest lesson of all. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity and reflection. I poured myself into building bridges between the desert and the city, between tradition and technology, between survival and hope. I coordinated a shipment of supplies to Hassan's community: solar-powered radios, medical kits, sturdy tools, and food staples. Layla and Hassan's messages of gratitude reached me through handwritten letters and grainy photos, reminding me of the lives I had touched and that had touched me in return. One day, I received a call from the local desert rescue unit, the same team that had found me. They wanted to collaborate on a project to improve communication and emergency response across remote areas of the Sahara. I eagerly agreed. Together, we developed training programs, shared survival knowledge, and invested in better equipment. The desert was no longer a place to fear but a landscape to understand and respect. Returning to the desert for the second time was profoundly different. I traveled not as a lost man but as a friend, carrying gifts and stories, ready to learn and give back. Sitting around the campfire with Hassan, Layla, and the others, I felt a deep sense of peace. The desert's harshness was still there, but so was its beauty, a beauty born of resilience, community, and the unbreakable human spirit. The trials I had faced, the broken vehicle, the endless sand, the nights spent under the stars had forged anew me. A man who knew the value of hope, of perseverance, and of kindness. As the sun dipped below the dunes, painting the sky in fiery reds and golds, I whispered a silent thanks to the desert that had taken so much but given even more. My journey was far from over. But I was ready for whatever came next. After returning to the desert community, I found a rhythm that balanced both worlds, the city I came from and the endless sands I had come to respect. The relationships I built with Hassan, Layla, and the others deepened with every visit, each meeting filled with shared stories and exchanged knowledge. The desert had become more than just a place of survival, it was a symbol of resilience, humility, and connection. I saw how the community adapted, not by fighting the desert, but by listening to it, understanding its moods, and moving with its rhythms. Back in the city, I continued my work as a tower inspector, but with a new perspective. I began advocating for better safety protocols, especially for those working in harsh and remote environments. I pushed for improved communication devices, robust survival gear, and regular training on emergency desert survival techniques. I also started a blog, sharing my story and survival lessons with a wider audience. Readers from around the world wrote to me, some inspired, others seeking advice, and many sharing their own tales of resilience. It was humbling and motivating. One day, I received a message from a young woman in a remote village, thanking me for the survival tips and explaining how she used them during a sandstorm to protect her family. That moment reminded me why I had to keep sharing. The desert was a harsh teacher, but it had also been a great mentor. It taught me patience, adaptability, and the power of community. As I looked toward the horizon from my home's rooftop, the sun setting over the city skyline, I felt a deep gratitude. The trials I had faced in the Sahara were not just memories, they were a foundation for a new life, a new mission. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I could face them. Because I was no longer just a man lost in the desert, I was a survivor, a learner, and a bridge between worlds. Here's part 20, the final part of your Sahara survival story, wrapping up with reflection, hope, and closure, about 900 words. The day I finally returned home, the air felt different, softer, filled with familiar scents and the gentle hum of life. The city was noisy, busy, and full of distractions, but for me, it was a sanctuary. After weeks lost in the Sahara's endless sea of sand and sun, surrounded by silence and struggle, this bustling world was a gift. My family rushed to greet me, their faces alight with relief and joy. My daughter Salma clung to me, whispering, "I was so worried, Daddy." My wife Fatima's embrace was steady and warm, grounding me in the life I almost lost. But even as I smiled, I knew the desert was forever part of me. The lessons it taught, resilience, patience, humility, had changed my very core. In the days that followed, I settled back into routine, but I also found new purpose. I kept in touch with Hassan and Layla, sending supplies and planning more visits. I continued sharing my story publicly, hoping to prepare others for the unexpected and to honor the desert community that saved me. I spoke at conferences, wrote articles, and trained teams heading into harsh environments. My journey became more than survival, it became a mission of education, connection, and hope. Sometimes, when the world felt overwhelming, I'd look up at the night sky, remembering those endless stars above the desert dunes. I'd whisper thanks to the Sahara, harsh, beautiful, and merciless, for shaping me into a man who understood what it truly meant to survive. The desert taught me that even in the vastest, loneliest places, hope can be found. And sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from the technology we trust or the paths we plan, but from the kindness of strangers, the wisdom of nature, and the unyielding human spirit. I was lost, but now I was found.